Okay, good morning, everybody. I apologize that this is going up a little bit later than usual, but I made the mistake of updating my operating system. And the proverb, never mess with things if they ain't broke, is really true, because it's engendered all sorts of problems, which I've only just sorted out. So forgive me for being a little bit late this morning. Okay, so we are just going to finish off talking about our story about the vertebrates, and we're going to go all the way up today to the mammals themselves before we talk in our next class about some of the details about mammals. What I want to remind you of is that the most important evolutionary advance, which allowed animals to penetrate onto land, onto the dryness of land, was the development of the amniotic egg. And the amniotic egg is one which will survive conditions which would otherwise dehydrate eggs, for instance, like those of the amphibians. Instead, the amniotic egg has around it shell or membranes. Remember that not all amniotic eggs have a shell made of calcium carbonate like the birds. Many organisms have amniotic eggs, which instead have a tough set of membranes around the outside. But the function of these membranes is to allow the passage of gases in and out without having the egg dehydrate. So the shell or the membranes around the outside limit the amount of water that evaporates. And that advance alone freed the amniotes from dependence on water for reproduction. That is the thing that ties the amphibians to water. They are dependent on water for their reproduction. I will say that for the amphibians, there are a few which have very specialized reproductive strategies, but which allow them, for instance, to penetrate some distance into land. But those are very specialized strategies where they effectively create, those amphibians effectively, one way or another, create an aquatic environment for their eggs and larvae to develop. And the vast majority of amphibians are limited to reproduction in water. So the amniotic egg freed organisms from that requirement and allowed them to penetrate far onto land with obviously they still need water, as every living thing does, but their reproductive strategies now usually entailed some sort of internal fertilization. That's number one. In the amphibians, eggs and sperm are released into water and fertilization is external. In the amniotes, it is usually internal, and the amniotic organism produces this complex structure where the early stages of development of the embryo take place within a shelled egg. I want to just emphasize some of the structures here, because in fact, we're going to see the same kind of structure throughout the vertebrates that we're going to talk about. And that may strike you as a bit strange, because you can think, well, what about us? What about things like humans? Where is our egg, so to speak? Well, first of all, let's think about things like the birds and the reptiles. They lay an egg that looks much like this. It has a shell and an outer membrane there. In the center here, there is a gel-like substance. It's mostly albumin, a protein, and that is a nutrient store, a nutrient source for the developing embryo. But it's also protective. Effectively, the embryo floats in that jelly, in that gel of albumin. So it is protective as well. The embryo is entirely contained within a set of membranes. The outer one here is called the chorion. The next one here is here, and it's around here. That is called the allantois. And then there's a third one that gives its name to this reproductive structure, and that is the amnion, which is the membrane that surrounds the embryo itself. Now, in organisms like the birds and the reptiles, there is also a yolk sac. This is a sac of nutrients, mostly lipids, some proteins as well. It's very, very rich in cholesterol, for example, and things like that. And again, this is a nutrient source for the embryo. What I want you to have a look at, though, are these two membranes here, the chorion and the allantois. Now, in organisms like us, we have an entirely internal development of the embryo. None of our development takes place outside. It's all inside. We are said to be viviparous. And in those organisms which are entirely viviparous, this outer structure here is lost. There's no shell or outer membrane around it. Instead, our embryo is entirely enclosed in these three membranes: the chorion, allantois, and amnion. And if you can just imagine the allantois and the chorion here, and the structure here, forming a placenta, which embeds into the uterus wall, then you'll have a very good idea, a very good picture in your mind of what our embryo looks like during development in the uterus. We have the same structures, basically. We lack this outer shell, but we possess all of these structures here. We don't have a yolk sac in the advanced mammals, but we have, you can just picture this chorion and allantois structure here in now embedding itself into a uterus wall, and all the membranes enclosing our embryo, still with the amnion right around the embryo. And that's what we would look like in utero. In the uterus would be this structure, this whole inner structure here embedded into the placenta. So there you get a very good idea that our roots are still lie with this amniotic ancestor that first developed this amniotic egg. Okay, so I said to you before, we believe that most of the early amniotes were small predators, probably initially associated with the margins of the land, but able to penetrate further and further inland as there were elaborations on the development of this amniotic egg. So we end up with a complex group of tetrapods, to which we, of course, belong. And we need to try and sort out how these are actually organized. Now, I'm old-fashioned, and occasionally will let slip something which is now regarded as being incorrect. And you can send me furious emails whenever I do so, because I probably won't notice. The mistake I still make is in confusing this division here. Here is the ancestral amniot. The ancestral amniot is believed to have given rise to two major groups. And these groups can be distinguished by their skull structures, which we're not going to discuss in detail. I'll simply tell you that there are distinct skull structures which serve as derived characters for both of these groups. And they allow us to divide the amniots into the diapsids there and the synapsids there. And my mistake is I will frequently let slip that and call these the mammal-like reptiles. And that is incorrect because they are no longer regarded as being reptilian. In the old days, when I was a spring chicken, these both were regarded as being reptilian groups, which I rather like because it means that we are in fact reptiles. And that is indeed what many scientists still believe. But the commonly accepted phylogeny now is that this group here are not reptiles. They are not reptilian. This is the only reptilian group here, and that's what we will stick with. Okay, we'll say that the diapsids here are our reptile group, and the synapsids, the early synapsids that I'll show you and talk about, which I think of as being mammal-like reptiles. They do indeed look reptilian, but there are very distinct characters which set them apart from the reptiles themselves. So here are the diapsid group, and within that early diapsid group, we believe there was a common ancestor to all of the reptiles, both living and extinct. And there are many, many, many extinct reptile groups. They have been a very successful group and still are. Very diverse and at times extremely numerous. In fact, at times would have been regarded as the dominant terrestrial and aquatic vertebrate groups as well. So let's have a look first of all at this whole group that we refer to as being reptile. Reptiles have some distinct characteristics, and all of the reptiles have scales or highly modified scales. They are highly modified for terrestrial life in that they have a tough outer skin. They do not have a soft, moist skin the way that the amphibians had. They are all true amniotes. They produce an egg, but there is one caveat to that, and that is that there are reptile groups which actually give birth to live young, but they don't have that placental structure that I described to you earlier. Instead, you can think of it rather as being the female keeps the egg inside and allows it to develop, and the young hatch and are born live. In some of the reptiles that do that, they actually lay the egg immediately before the young emerge. But in other cases, the young are hatched inside the female and are born live. And now that's a strange situation. So let's just think about this for a minute. We have some which lay an egg outside and it develops outside entirely. We have others like us where the young develop entirely inside us without a shell, with that or something like the placental structure, whatever. And then we've got this group in the middle. We've got some reptiles that hold the egg inside. So those which lay outside entirely are said to be oviparous. We who have our development entirely internally with no shell but placental, we are said to be viviparous. And those which have an egg but keep the egg inside, the amniotic egg inside for development, are said to be ovoviviparous. Ovoviviparous means you can hear halfway between the two. Outside entirely, oviparous. Inside entirely, viviparous. And between two, ovoviviparous. And we find all of these different strategies in all of these groups, including the mammals, okay? We need to always keep in mind that we are amniotes. And there's going to be some very good evidence of that when we talk about the mammals themselves. Okay, so this is a complex phylogeny, and it is not entirely clear. The exact relationship of some of these reptile groups to one another is not clear and is often subject to controversy. But let's just have a look first at this clade here, which is quite distinct clade, both based on morphologies and on molecular biology as well. Suggests to us this is a very ancient group. These are called the lepidosaurs. And the lepidosaurs consist of two groups. One that you may not have heard of, called the tuataras. These are New Zealand, found in New Zealand, for example, a very primitive lizard-like group, the tuataras. There are all sorts of interesting things about the tuataras. One of the things is they have quite a well-developed third eye in top of the skull. Other members of the lepidosaurs also do have, as I'll mention in a minute, but much less developed than in the tuataras. The tuataras, that third eye can actually distinguish light and shade. Can't form an image, but it can distinguish light and shade. We believe that third, if you want to think about a third eye, is maintained actually in many other groups as well, but forms an endocrine gland eventually called the pineal. But in the tuataras, it's quite obvious in the top of the skull. So those are the tuataras. I'll show you a picture in a minute. The other lepidosaurs you'll definitely know about, and these are the lizards and the snakes. And here, let's have a look here. Here's tuatara. You can see it's lizard-like, iguana-like, but it has very distinct anatomical features which set it apart. Here are the lizards. All of the lizards and the snakes belong together. They are called the squamates, the squamata, and they are also lepidosaurs, very, very closely related. And their major distinction has arisen because of developments for locomotion. And I'm just checking something, sorry. And that is that in the snakes, the legs have been lost, and instead they have opted for an entirely different kind of locomotion, locomotion generated by sinuous movements of the body, but also they have very highly adapted scales on the bottom of the body, which move the organism along. We know that they're closely related because, in fact, first of all, there is a whole group of lizards which have very, very small legs and which behave very like snakes, look pretty much like snakes too. But there are also very primitive snakes, what we regard as being primitive snakes, which have residual hind limbs, especially. The pythons are a good example of that. These are the snake form is an adaptation of the lizard structure. Now, I just want you to look at one thing, which is really important for all of the reptiles, and that is the stance, the way in which these organisms stand. Remember that organisms coming up onto land have to be adapted to resist gravity. And this is how the reptiles all do it. If you can picture it, they have legs which come up and then across and suspend the body, okay, like that. Have a look here and you'll see what I mean. Here's the body. The humerus comes out almost at right angles, and then the rest of the limb is below that at right angles. And it gives the reptile, they all have this kind of squat look, but now imagine that when they move a leg forward, the whole body swings. The whole body swings like this. We're going to see that later on in more advanced tetrapods, the stance is changed to what we have, with the limbs coming, the body directly supported by the limbs. And in that system, the limb moves independent of the body. When the limb moves, it induces the least possible movement in the body. This stance here, this reptilian stance, is actually less efficient than the later, more advanced stance that we see in the tetrapods. Okay, so this is our first group. These are the lepidosaurs. If I can get back. All right, so there they are there. The next giant grouping are all of these here. And these are the other reptile groups. I will tell you first of all, the turtles and tortoises, that whole group, we are very unsure about. They're an ancient group, but they're definitely reptilian, but their exact relationship to the rest of the reptiles is absolutely not certain. But here they are, a very interesting group indeed. And of course, all of them have the adaptation that they have taken outer scales and have welded the scales together to form the shell into which they can withdraw. So those are turtles and tortoises. The next group, this is a clade called the archosaurs. And that is virtually all the rest of the reptiles that we'll know about. The first very, very ancient group, and these are the crocodiles, the crocodilians. And it is it depends who you talk to, but it is widely believed that this ancestral archosaur here somewhere gave rise to this whole group, that the crocodilians are more similar to that ancient ancestor than the rest. In other words, we can see traces of the ancestry, some people believe, in the morphology of the crocodiles. Crocodiles, there are in fact a number of species on several of the continents, Africa, the Americas, and in Asia. They are very often large, clearly reptilian, and think about the way that they stand. If you've ever seen movies or seen them in live, you'll realize that they have that typical stance, reptilian stance, and as they move on land, they move relatively inefficiently, because every time they pull a leg forward, they have to sway the rest of the body behind it to move. We now, those are the crocodilians. We're now going to have a look at this huge group here, most of whom are actually extinct. And these are those glamorous reptiles, all of the dinosaurs and their associates. Not everything that looks big and ancient is a dinosaur, but they are all reptilian. Then many of these groups that we're going to talk about, they have in a way evaded this problem of locomotion that things like the crocodiles, the lizards all have, of this inefficient waddling motion. They have evaded it simply by going upright on two limbs. So they've gone upright onto back legs, not all of them, but this is a marked tendency within all of these groups. We begin to see that they have gone upright onto the back legs, and the legs have been pulled in directly underneath the body, and that gives them a much more efficient system of movement. So within the fossil record, these ancient groups, the ones that we are fondest of, are the dinosaurs. And that dinosaur, yeah, it refers to this. It refers to the fact that these all have opted for two-legged locomotion. And that has been a driving factor for most of them. They're not all. Obviously, you'll realize if you know anything about the fossil record, there are those which are very distinctly four-legged. But many of the four-legged ones were also associated with aquatic environments where they were supported by water. So let's have a look at the dinosaurs. I unfortunately can't spend a lot of time discussing them, but obviously a huge and very fascinating group, and they lived for more than 100 million years or so. They were a dominant group in terrestrial systems. They varied. Not all dinosaurs were these huge predatory organisms. There were many, many small, obscure dinosaurs. They were, at their height, a very, very diverse group. And they are divided into two distinct groups. They were called the Ornithischian dinosaurs, and then the Saurischian dinosaurs. And the Ornithischia, a huge and diverse group all of their own. The Saurischians contained those ones that we know best, like Tyrannosaurus and those sort of things. Let me just see. Okay, no, sorry. I thought I had a picture of Saurischians, but I don't. Okay, so these major groups, the Ornithischia and the Saurisschia, were hugely diverse, but about 90 million years ago, 85 million years ago, they began to decline in diversity. So I only tell you that because we always think about the end of the dinosaurs as having been the single cataclysmic event where an asteroid hit and they were all wiped out. Well, that is not really true. They were a very, very, very diverse group, but they appear to have started to decline and may have been on their way, many of the dinosaur groups, to extinction anyway, when this cataclysmic event, the striking of an asteroid off the coast of Mexico, produced a worldwide cataclysm. And that cataclysm was not only the result of the direct force of impact of the asteroid with a blast wave and fire radiating around the world, etc., but it induced a lengthy period of climate change. A winter, in fact, set in for a very long time. And that's, in addition to the direct effect of the impact of the asteroid, this long-term climate change, the dinosaurs could not survive. They weren't the only things which didn't survive it. There were many other groups as well. And some of them we just don't think about. There were many, many marine groups which became extinct during this event. That is the first thing. The second thing is most of the dinosaurs died out as a result. That's the second thing. But the one group that we don't think about are the plants. Now, at this time that all of the dinosaurs were extant on the Earth, there were very few flowering plants. There were some. They existed. But there were very few. It was not like it is now. In fact, the dinosaurs lived in a world of coniferous plants for the most part. It's things that would resemble redwoods, pine trees, all of these sorts of trees, not the flowering plants that we see dominant around us today. And this is the important thing about an event like the asteroid hitting. It wipes out major groups. Right? It wiped out the dinosaurs. It wiped out most of the plants. But somewhere there in those groups, there are survivors. Not individual. I don't mean individuals. I mean species that are able to survive. And from those remaining species, these radiations arise to produce entirely new groupings. Once those major groups are removed by the cataclysm, by the mass extinction, all sorts of ecological niches open up. Let's just think, we'll think first for a minute about the plants. They're in all of the plant populations of the Earth. At the time of the dinosaurs, mostly these things, like redwoods and those sorts of plants. Most of those are wiped out by this cataclysmic event, but that opens up all sorts of ecological niches. And the flowering plants begin to radiate into those niches. At the same time as those flowering plants begin to radiate, what do flowering plants depend on for their fertilization? Absolutely, they depend upon insects. And as the flowering plant populations radiate and diversify, so the insect populations match with them and begin to evolve together with them. So we begin to see an entirely new ecosystems evolving as a result of the mass extinction. Now, the same thing we believe happened with these dinosaur populations. There were, at the same time as the dinosaurs existed, as the Tyrannosaurus and everything was thundering around, there were dinosaurs, most of them quite small, which were developing very specialized features. For a long time, they probably were just smaller groups within this overall huge diversity. But once these immense dinosaurs, once the major dinosaurs were removed by the mass extinction, these smaller dinosaur groups survived. And what we see, what they evolved into, we see today as the birds. The birds are, in fact, closely, we believe, very closely related to the Saurischian dinosaurs. And birds exhibit many, many, many reptilian features. They, first of all, they lay external eggs, which are clearly amniotic eggs. The feathers that birds have are in fact modified scales, but birds still have scales. If you don't believe me, pick up a chicken and look at its legs, and you will see that that birds still have reptilian scales on their legs. Their entire stance is very closely related to that, we believe, of many of the dinosaurs. And they were, in fact, they arose from an obscure dinosaur line, a Saurischian dinosaur line. So let's have a look here. They are here. So this is Saurischia here. All of these, Tyrannosaurus, all the rest of them, they were lost. On this diagram, wherever you see a little mark like that, it means that that's an extinct group. Many of them would have been lost in that asteroid impact, but not all of them. Some of them may have been rendered extinct for other reasons as well. I'll just mention that these group, the pterosaurs, were flying reptiles, another very big diverse group, and an indication of the importance of flight. As soon as flight evolves, it lifts a group into an entirely new environment and opens up all sorts of opportunities for them. So the development of flight is a very, very important driving force in evolutionary development. So those are the pterosaurs there. But notice something, that the pterosaurs they don't say they're entirely unrelated to the birds, but then the whole structure of the wing there is actually a convergent evolutionary feature. That is, the wings have evolved from the forelimbs, but it's not entirely analogous to the development of the bird wing. So, okay, so let me just see, here we are. This is one, I think still in your book, it will state that this is one of the earliest birds, this is the earliest bird rather, that we have in the fossil record, and this is Archaeopteryx. I believe, however, that fossils have been found in China, which predate Archaeopteryx, which is not surprising because this Archaeopteryx was recovered from slate mine in Germany, and it's of a line of birds which were already very far along. They had existed already for a long time. In Chinese fossils, there are more primitive birds than Archaeopteryx. Nonetheless, this shows us all sorts of reptilian features, which we can see here. First of all, look at the development of the wing, and you'll see that it's still got digits. In the modern bird, these digits here are entirely internal and incorporated into the structure of the wing. That, by the way, is the thumb. These are the fingers here. So in Archaeopteryx, the main structure of the wing is the humerus, the radius, and the ulna. The digits are not participating. In modern birds, the digits have become involved in the wing structure itself. Second of all, a very important difference between these primitive birds and modern birds. The primitive ones have teeth. They have teeth in the jaw here. Modern birds do not. Second of all, they have more scales. The face was scaled, for example, as well as the legs were scaled in the primitive ones. The next difference is they had a long tail with many, many vertebrae. In the modern birds, all of these vertebrae are consolidated into a little collection of bone at the end of the spine here. They don't have the long tail like this. Now, looking at this, we sort of have to consider for ourselves, here are many, many reptilian features. They certainly, there are others which look even more reptilian than this. What was going on? First of all, how was the feather developed? And what was the feather developed for? Was it developed for flight? No, evolution doesn't work like that. Evolution doesn't sit back and say, I want this organism to do this thing, therefore I'm going to create this kind of structure. No, it does not work like that. Evolution builds slowly on modifying structures. Each time the structure is modified to slight advantage to the organism, that modification is retained in the population and then becomes elaborated on. Feathers are elaborations on the scale, and their organization into the wing and on the body are there for purposes now which they may not have been originally. Their original purpose may have been slightly different, somewhat different to what we see now. There are two lines of thought. The first is that the development of feathers was mainly for insulation, for heat control. These were very small organisms, most of them, the primitive, the ancestors to the birds. They were relatively small. And the feathers may have assisted them in heat control. That's the first thing. They may also have evolved for camouflage or courtship or something like that. That is a possibility, but it's not one that is very easily established. But in the development of the feathers, other traits began to become apparent. First of all, if an organism developed these feathers on the wings, when the wing was flapped, it would produce a little burst of forward momentum by pushing against the air behind it. These feathers on the wings may have begun to be advantageous because they assisted, especially in like moving uphill or something like this. Now that may sound extraordinary, but it's actually, we actually see this behavior in modern birds, in some modern birds, ground-dwelling birds. When they have to move uphill, for example, they will flap their wings, not fly, but push themselves through the air while they are running. Now, that may not sound like much, but think of the advantage that an organism like that would have if it's being chased, for example, by a predator. It gets a little bit of extra speed and lift to get away from the predator. It's in our imagination, pushing that organism and its descendants through several 100,000 years is not far from doing that to get away from a predator, getting a little bit of extra push ahead to actually being able to launch for a little bit and glide and land. Run, flap, launch, glide, land. It's not very far from there in evolutionary terms to actually developing flight itself. And we believe that may in fact be have been one of the driving forces. Certainly modern fossils recovered from China especially suggest to us that many of the ancestors of the birds were in fact ground-dwelling, running organisms that were not able to actually fly, but were able to launch themselves and glide, launch and glide. True flight developed afterwards. This whole group are called the theropods. The group that led to they were carnivorous dinosaurs, and the theropods actually were the ancestors to the modern birds. This Archaeopteryx remains the oldest bird known. That may be true because Archaeopteryx is regarded as being a true bird. So it may be that Archaeopteryx is the oldest true bird known. I'm not sure about, but older fossils than Archaeopteryx have been found, which are truly reptilian, but which distinctly have feathers. And that is the marker. That is a real marker. In fact, there are many paleontologists who believe that feathers may have been a common feature for dinosaur theropod groups who have nothing to do with the birds. That feathers may have been a character for that whole group of the theropods. So the development of flight is a hugely important one in a group like the birds. It takes that group into an entirely new world, an entirely new ecological world. It allows there are all sorts of advantages to flying, getting away from predators, being able to move easily between habitats, being able to search food for yourself. Remember that many of the early birds would have been carnivorous. Being able to chase down prey and for feeding. But when we look at the birds, we also see that there are many derived characters that have been acquired because of flight. And the first one, of course, is the presence of feathers. And feathers are incredibly complex structures. Here's pluck a feather out of a bird wing, and it consists of these smaller units on the feather, which all link together to form a single unit. And that unit on the feather is able to resist the force of air being pushed against it during flight. This is what they consist of. Though each fine unit of the feather consists of a shaft and then has barbs on it, and the barbs themselves all link together to form a single unit like that. And you would realize that there would be, in evolutionary development, there would have to be many, many steps developing this structure from the simple scale from which it originated. In the modern birds, with one exception, this is the structure that we see. Here is the humerus, here is the radius and the ulna, and these are the wrist bones here. That's the equivalent of that. And then the digits have all been highly modified. This is the thumb there. Others have been united to form, these here are actually the equivalent of the metacarpals of your hand here. And here at the end are the bone, are the rest of the digits kind of unified and reduced to form this section here. I say there was one exception. There are a group of birds which still possess a thumb which is free, and with an associated digit which is actually able to grasp like this. But in most birds, this the one here actually operates somewhat independently. It has its own little group of feathers associated with it, and it's very, very important in the function of the aerodynamics of the wing, because it can be lifted out and in, rather like the flaps of a jet wing that are used to trim the flight of a fixed wing. So on the wing of a bird, this little thumb lifting like this can be used to trim the aerodynamics of the wing. So this is, you can see the whole hand now highly, highly modified. When we look at the rest of the bird, we'll find that there is an extraordinary set of structures. First of all, most of the bones are hollow like this. They're extremely strong, extremely, extremely strong, because they have to resist in flight. They have to resist tremendous amount of pressure on them, of stress on them. But here, this is what they look like. They're hollow inside, but with these bony struts, these thin bony struts, which strengthen the bones. There are a couple of other things to tell you about the birds. First of all, birds are endothermic. That is that they maintain a constant body temperature. That is very similar to us. So that is a feature which is not unique to groups like the mammals. Okay, the birds are endothermic. We believe, in fact, that many of the theropods and maybe many of the Saurischian dinosaurs had a similar characteristic, that they were endothermic. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, flying requires a very, very high metabolism. It utilizes a tremendous amount of oxygen. And ordinary respiratory systems are not able to efficiently supply, would not be able to efficiently supply a bird with the oxygen that it requires. The reason for that is just think about how we breathe. Just take a breath in, breathe out. Just think about what you're doing. When you take in a breath, you're pulling in oxygen to your lungs. But what are you doing? You're actually mixing that oxygen together with carbon dioxide that is already present in your lungs. When you breathe out, you're breathing out carbon dioxide, but you're also breathing out some of the oxygen that you first took in. It's not a terribly efficient system. It's fine for our kind of locomotion and everything. Even when we run, we can run a certain distance. Okay, we can't run an enormous distance very fast. But for all our purposes, our respiratory system functions pretty well. But for birds, it does not. It's not enough. And in birds, an extremely efficient respiratory system has evolved where there is no mixing of oxygenated and of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the respired gases. Instead, the respiratory system is a one-way system. It has a system where part of it is inflated with fresh air. The other part is compressed to expel carbon dioxide. And on the next respiration, the entirely fresh oxygen is taken in pure and unmixed with carbon dioxide. If you are interested in it, I believe there is a section in your book which will describe it to you. I would just use a simple analogy. It's rather like bagpipes. Okay, so if you imagine somebody playing the bagpipes, what do you have in somebody playing the bagpipes? You have two sets of lungs. Okay, you've got the person playing the bagpipes. They have their lungs, and then next to them they have a spare lung, which is the bag of the bagpipes. What do? They continually breathe into that bag and inflate it, and then press it to expel air to play the dreadful bagpipe music. And then while they're doing that, they are breathing in, ready to breathe out into the bag when it starts to deflate. That is something similar to what the birds are doing. And effectively what they end up with is a one-way flow of oxygenated air through. And I will just mention that these hollows in the bones participate in this. They actually act as a store as well. They are connected to this entire respiratory system. And the respiratory system of the birds, the take-home message for you to remember is that the bird respiratory system is extremely efficient, and it supplies high oxygen levels to the bird continuously, where we, in fact, mix carbon dioxide and oxygen in our lungs. The birds do not. Unfortunately, that's all I can tell you about the birds. And I'm going to finish off just by showing you a little bit of what we're going to be talking about in the mammals. And I want to just, come back here to this phylogeny. Remember what I told you, that this ancestral amniot led to these two great clades, the diapsids and the synapsids. The diapsids are all of these that we've talked about, the reptiles and the birds. And our living groups were birds, the turtles, crocodiles, birds, the tuataras, and then the lizards and snakes. But this other group here are called the synapsids. And they were, in fact, a very big, very dominant group long before anything like the dinosaurs arose. They were, in fact, a dominant group, and the true reptiles, the diapsids, were relatively obscure. It was the dying out of the synapsids in the Permian, and think back and you'll remember the Permian, the end of the Permian was one of the great mass extinctions. And what was wiped out was almost all of the synapsids, except for one little group of synapsids, and those went on to form the mammals. So this synapsid group is tremendously important. Synapsid fossils are found in many parts of the world, very importantly in South Africa, in some in Americas as well, and in Russia. So they existed prior to the major separation of the continents. And they were very widespread, very, very diverse. And here are some of them here. You see they vary from enormous predatory kinds to small herbivorous, probably, kinds. And I just put in this correction on your slide. It actually says mammal-like reptiles, synapsid reptiles. They used to be called the mammal-like reptiles. I put a line through this just to be in accord with your textbook, because and with current thinking, but these are not, despite what they look like, these are not true reptiles. They have many, many reptilian features, but they are not true reptiles. The reptilian features they have, obviously the skin structure. They laid eggs, that they were true amniotes, that is true. What is very reptilian about them is their stance. Look at them, and you see how they stand in that typical way that I described. There are things about them, though, which are not reptilian at all, and which now lead us to call them, in actual fact, the proto-mammals. And these are regarded as being extremely primitive mammalian types. Out of this huge group of the synapsids will arise the line which leads to the mammals. And the very first sign that we have that that may be true is if we look at the jaw. First of all, there are features of the skull, which we won't discuss, which are much more mammalian. But the one thing about the skull which you can see that is mammalian, even on this diagram, is that they have differentiated teeth. The reptile tooth is completely different. Reptiles have many, many teeth, not only on the mandible, maxilla, whatever. They may also have teeth on the roof of the mouth. And their teeth are all very similar in structure. And their teeth are continually replaced in the reptiles. In the proto-mammals, the teeth begin to be differentiated. Have a look here. You can see this one has canines here. If we look, we see that they have incisors. They have premolars and molars. Not fully differentiated, but very, very distinctly, they begin to look like they are distinguished one from the other for different purposes. Some for stabbing, some for cutting, some for chewing. The second thing is that we believe about these proto-mammals is that there would be a juvenile set of teeth and then a mature set of teeth, which were not continually replaced. There are some other things about them which are not quite so obvious. The eyes, for example, begin to move forward in the skull. In the reptiles, they are fully on the sides of the skull. But in the mammal, in these synapsids, I see I nearly said mammal-like reptile. In the synapsids, they begin to move forward on the skull, and the organism begins to look straight ahead and acquire binocular vision. They still laid eggs, but we believe that some of them may have been ovoviviparous as well. If you've ever been to the Natural History Museum, these are ones that you may have seen, skeletons. These are the dimetrodons, for example, that have these big sails above them. These are a feature for regulating temperature. These were quite large animals. It is very possible that they were all endothermic, and they would have had great difficulty regulating body temperature, especially if they were large. And these huge sails above, and the larger ones are a way of cooling for them. So these are the synapsids. Almost all of them wiped out at the end of the Permian, in the Great Permian extinction, which led to the loss of something like 60–70% of species all over the world. But one group of synapsids survived. And this was probably one of these small synapsids that actually went on to develop, in evolutionary time, lead to the mammal line. So we refer to these as being proto-mammals. They lead to the proper mammalian line, and we'll talk about that again next time. Okay, so I'm sorry, again, I apologize that this is a little bit late, but I hope that, nonetheless that you have been able to follow, that you're able to do this soon. Remember that we'll carry on this discussion on Monday, and Monday will be a live class. Sorry, I'm dithering.